participants that signed up and were unable to make today's meeting can still participate. Everybody will be receiving the video recording after the meeting. So before we start, we just want to tell you a little bit about the San Diego Regional Urban Forest Council. We are a member-driven coalition of municipalities, agencies, businesses, educators, and community members working to improve our urban forest assets. We promote the benefit of trees for a cleaner, healthier, and more prosperous San Diego region. We do things like put together networking events and different educational meetings and webinars like this one today. And we are currently recruiting for both membership and for our executive committee. And we have several subcommittees. We have an event and fundraising committee, an outreach, engagement, and membership committee, and an education and advocacy committee. If you're interested in getting involved, please go ahead and contact us. You can reach us through email. So we have, oh, I didn't put the, oh yeah, wait, the San Diego Regional Urban Forest Council at gmail.com. Our website is listed here and our Instagram as well. And I'm the chair, Megan Shaw. If you would like to reach out to me directly, you can reach me on my work email. I work for the County of San Diego. I'm the Urban Forestry Coordinator, and my email is listed here. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Francisco, and he's going to go ahead and present to you on early lessons from Palisades and Eaton Fire.
Good morning, everybody. Can you see my screen? Can you? I'm not able to see the screen, so if someone can tell me if they see
it's good. Thanks a lot.
All right, thank you. Sorry about that. All right, so thank you for the invitation. Today I'll talk about the science behind fires, urban forests, and some of the experiences and some of the lessons, some of the research we've been doing in other communities that have been affected by wildfires. So the first part will be on some of the research we've been doing in some of the communities that have been affected by fire in Northern California, Louisville, Colorado, Southern Oregon. And then we'll shift over to the LA fires. And I'll give you some examples, some observations, some things we've seen, some work we're doing. But the central theme here is just how these events, how fires in urban forests are just very different than when we think about wildland-urban interface fires and wildfire. The effects we're seeing, the dynamics we're seeing are just very different. So this is the take-home message, and I'm giving it to you at the beginning, is that these are more urban fires driven by wildfires, not wildfires per se, and I'll explain why. So,
all right, just a second. We've got a lot of static here, and I have muted everyone that's come in, except you, Megan. But that's it. Is it better now? Try speaking, Francisco. Otherwise, you say a couple more sentences.
Okay, so this presentation is about urban fires.
Is there a way you can log in? Is there a way you can log in and come back in again?
I think what might help is if Francisco just switches off his own video, so then there'll be enough broadband for his voice to be heard clearly.
Okay. How's that?
Keep speaking.
Can you hear me now? How's this? Can you hear me good? You still hear me?
Better.
Is that better?
Not better.
Okay. Continue?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So these experiences, we haven't just seen them here in California, but we've seen them now in Hawaii, South America, Southern Europe, Colorado, Southern Oregon. So I'll be referring to this term or this concept that's recently starting to be used, which are referred to as urban fires.
All right, we're going to, Francisco, can you log out and come back in again?
Yeah, I can.
We're going to close your screen and we'll just have some conversation back and forth that maybe Megan can
All right.
lead a little bit about how we decided to do this.
Will do.
Yeah, let's try that. And there's also been a couple really good articles in the LA Times and the New York Times. I'll put links to those in the chat. The other thing is, Megan, do you have access to that Britain Foundation one-pager to what to do with trees that are, as you, if they've been burned by wildfire? That's a really good one. We'll put a link to that one too, but that would be something we can look at in the meantime. It's really basically saying, give these guys a chance. Many of them will actually be, they'll recover. They'll be fine. Yeah. Greg, have you had experiences with trees that, as Greg's a landscaper, have you had experiences with trees burning and then coming back to those same clients, and what are the likelihoods? What do you do with a tree rather than chopping it down the day after the fire?
No, we had the opposite experience. We've had trees act as ember catchers and coolers as long as they are hydrated. And one of the things that I've been talking about is creating green belts around communities instead of ice plant. And the native plants have been exceptional because it's all, for us, it's been all about hydration, and it takes so little water to actually hydrate a native plant. So we've had exceptional good luck. And I just got tested again a week ago last Saturday. So it seems to be bearing out with the Navy study. So trees can actually be our friend, but I will tell you, not avocado trees. Those dry leaves and that water sucking plant that can't seem to hang on to its water in fires, that's one of the exceptions. Palm trees, fan palms, also ridiculous in fires.
Looks like we got Francisco back here.
How's this? Can you hear me now again?
Perfect.
Okay, so I'm going to share and then continue.
Thank you.
All right, that better now? Can you see the screen?
Super.
Okay, apologies. So I was here. These events we've been experiencing here in Los Angeles, we've experienced them in Northern California and other parts of the world. So this kind of brings us to this reality that what we used to think of as wildland-urban interface fires, we're now trying to think of this as urban fires. And these are fires that occur in predominantly urban land uses, residential, high density, medium density, commercial, institutional areas, and not so much this interface, intermix areas that are dominated by natural vegetation. So the way we've been approaching these is that fire is bad, so we need to manage for fuels around homes. So we've proposed these defensible space zones. You see plant lists, but the issue we have is that a lot of these homeowners don't want to completely denude their landscapes of vegetation, and for all the reasons we described as the benefits, the services. So we treat vegetation as something that needs to be managed, right? Minimized to mitigate fire in these more urban interface areas. However, in urban areas, from the urban and community forestry side, we advocate the opposite. Lots of green leafy vegetation for temperature cooling, air pollution removal, property values. But again, in Southern California, we really can't have this much vegetation next to homes, right? So this is our conundrum, the situation we're in. What's that ideal mix of how much vegetation, where to place that vegetation, what type of vegetation? So I'll show you some initial research where we try to address that. So I'll give you some lessons from other parts of California, research we've done, some research we're currently doing where we've evaluated how urban vegetation types interact with building loss during 2 fires. And then I'll give you some observations and some lessons and some things we're seeing in both the Eaton and Palisades fire here in the LA area. So this is some research we did 2 years ago where we took all the urban communities in California and the number of times they've been affected by wildfire over 10 years, from 2010 to 2020. And you see that increasing trend. So from what we're seeing, what we're experiencing is, yes, this occurrence of fires in cities is now more common. We're seeing that renters are now being influenced. We're seeing that it's primarily homeowners, not necessarily low-income folks that are being impacted, at least in these cities, but folks that own homes and are probably middle class, you could say. Other things we've noticed when we look at this from a regional scale of analysis, when we look at ecoregions, is that the demographics of fire is also changing. So different demographic groups are being affected by fires in cities. Southern California, more Asian communities are being impacted. Interior North California, more Hispanic communities are being impacted. And this has implications for messaging and for communicating evacuations, mitigation treatments, etc. Another study we did a study looking at urban tree cover change in Ventura following the Thomas Fire, in Santa Rosa following the Tubbs Fire, and in Paradise following the Camp Fire. And we looked at neighborhoods that were affected by fire and adjacent neighborhoods that were not affected by fire. So those solid lines, that's tree cover over time in fire-affected neighborhoods. That dashed line represents non-fire affected neighborhoods. So 3 different communities, 3 different parts of California. We see 3 kind of different dynamics. In Ventura, we saw a decrease in tree cover in fire-affected areas for obvious reasons. But what was interesting was that 2 years later, that tree cover recovered to pre-fire levels and levels that were very similar to adjacent non-fire affected neighborhoods. Santa Rosa, we saw a decline in tree cover, but that decline stabilized, and it was similar to tree cover from adjacent neighborhoods that weren't affected by wildfire. Whereas in Paradise, after the Camp Fire, tree cover decreased, and it continues to decrease over time relative to areas that were not affected by wildfire. So what does this mean? That all communities, all urban forests respond differently to fire. At least in Ventura and Paradise, we saw that 20 to 25% of fire-affected neighborhoods were outside of areas that were defined and mapped as wildland-urban interface. And it seems that the ecology of urban forest is very similar to the surrounding ecology in chaparral, oak-dominated systems, or Sierra Nevada forested systems in terms of tree cover and fire response. The second study, we used remote sensing. We classified vegetation types around homes in terms of shrubs, dense trees, low density trees, herbaceous, bare ground, buildings, and we used 3-meter resolution remote sensing imagery. And we took a bunch of variables from the vegetation types, the direction of that vegetation relative to homes, the distance of those vegetation types relative to homes. We accounted for also the distance to buildings, density of buildings, building construction dates, building roof construction material. And then we started looking through statistics at this relationship between the types of vegetation, where they were at, but also how moist they were and where they were located in these defensible space buffers in zones 1, 0, 1, and 2. So you can see an example of the data we used, the damage inspection data. The buffers we located around those buildings from 0 to 5, 5 to 30, 30 to 100 feet. And then we used normalized difference water index to look at the moisture of that vegetation in these buffers relative to these homes that were damaged, affected, destroyed, or survived. And then we used a method called classification and regression trees that accounts for all these variables and identifies which variables were most related, were most able to predict the loss of that building. So in Ventura, what we found was that the most influential predictor of building loss was percent bare ground. And that was followed by drought condition tree moisture. Okay, so not vegetation per se, the presence of vegetation, but it was bare ground that was most related to building loss. In buffer 2, it was herbaceous moisture and shrub moisture. So again, not just the presence of vegetation, but how moist that vegetation was. And then buffer 3, that's when building density started to play a role. And again, bare ground was also influential. So that's Ventura, coastal California, chaparral dominated. In Paradise, for the first buffer from 0 to 5 feet, we found that bare ground was the most influential factor behind building loss, followed by distance to bare ground. And number 4 was overstory tree cover. In buffer 2, it was shrub moisture again, but then building density started to be a highly influential factor in building loss. And finally, number 3, it was distance to trees and building densities. Okay, so we can come back and talk a little bit about that later. But let me switch now to the LA fires. Okay, and I'll talk about the Eden fire that occurred in the Altadena area and the Palisades fire that occurred in Pacific Palisades. So here's some numbers to describe the conditions in Altadena for Eden. 17% cover, tree cover, as opposed to 24% cover in Pacific Palisades. There's some numbers on the number of structures affected, the average vintage when those homes were built. And this last numbers I think is really interesting. And when you think about that previous slide, in Altadena and in Pacific Palisades, on average, 6 homes were located within 100 feet. So when we think about these defensible space buffers, I think that has a lot of implications. Think about vegetation. On average, there were 2 homes within 30 feet, and 15 to 17% of all homes had another home within 5 feet. Some of the research we're doing, we're looking at individual tree effects, how much trees were either scorched, charred, consumed. We've measured some different metrics for trees along the rights of way. We've done some ground LiDAR measurements to model these landscapes and homes that have been damaged and survived. And then we're also doing some GIS and remote sensing analysis. This is some of the metrics that we're measuring, that we're looking at. The amount of crown that was scorched and the amount of crown that was consumed. And we've developed some measurements for the severity of bark char also. Here you see magnolia, and in those 3 different conditions, with some scorch, completely consumed, and with char and no char. And we've done this research in such a way that we could go back in the future in 6 months, 1 year, 3 years, and remeasure those trees. Some observations, we're noticing some really interesting things, that these were obviously wind-driven, ember-driven fires. We see a lot of examples where in the bark, if that ember landed, it burned that portion of the bark. A lot of cavities, as you see, seem to, that's where the ember landed, and that's where the tree was consumed. Areas with no vegetation, no litter, no hedges seem to have ignited in that spot where that ember landed. And you see a lot of this in the landscapes. With this data, we'll be able to parse out possibly tree types and how species responded, but at least now this is just my observation, at least from what I've seen. There's 2 pictures on the left from the Altadena area, 2 pictures on the right from Pacific Palisades, and it seems that vegetation height had a big influence on what vegetation survived, what didn't. The taller the vegetation in general, it seems to have done, survived, whereas lower growing vegetation seems to have been completely consumed. That picture on the right, that appears to be some root galleries that got completely consumed and just left the roots galleries exposed. When we think about this reality of the density of buildings, remember 15 to 17% of homes had a home within 5 feet. We see a lot of this where the home was damaged and the heat radiated outward, damaging the vegetation, not the other way around. That arrow shows where the structure was, how it radiated heat. We saw a lot of examples where hedges along homes were consumed. The home wasn't. We're not exactly sure why. And a lot of examples where the vegetation around the homes from 0 to 5 to 30 feet was green, but the structure was lost. And we see a lot of these examples also where the home was lost and the vegetation around it is intact. And I guess that's probably a reason or a result of these fires being driven by wind and embers. There's some examples of cypress trees right along homes. Cypress didn't go up in flames, but it seems that the radiant heat from the home caught a portion of it on fire. But what was really interesting is to see the whole entire tree did not become consumed. Palms seem to have done okay, to our surprise. A lot of eucalyptus trees that were well pruned, well maintained, seem to have done okay. Again, this is just my observations. We still need the data to figure that out. It's a couple of months now, so we're starting to see some trees respond. That's an example of a Licodumbar on the far left. That's where the arrow indicates where the heat was. Where the heat wasn't, it seems to have been recovered, but even where it was affected by heat, it's slowly starting to come back. Those two pictures on the right are from Louisville, Colorado, taken 2 years after a fire. As you can see, these trees are starting to recover. What looked like trees that were completely scorched, damaged, are eventually recovering. That home was built right next to a fire damaged tree. They decided to keep the tree, and as you see, it seems to be doing okay. So we've just released a post-fire urban forest recovery and restoration manual that's on the CAL FIRE website. We are doing some tree flammability research that we're writing up right now. We were going to do some homeowner surveys on how homeowners were maintaining vegetation before the fires in the Santa Rosa area, but we're thinking of using that survey down here in the Los Angeles area instead. So a really quick look. Was just some examples of some of the work we've been doing, and let me know if you have any questions.
Thank you. We do have a few questions here in the chat. Our first is, let's see here. John is asking, where did the damage assessment data come from?
So that was the damage inspection data from CAL FIRE. So that's one of the first activities that goes on after an incident, where teams go in and damage homes for the amount of damage the home experienced. So there's 5 or 6 different classes, everything from the home was completely undamaged to damaged, and that's available on the CAL FIRE website.
And are you saying trees should be in zone 0?
So, you know, these are just observations. So one thing we noticed in Ventura, again, it was tree moisture that influenced building loss. Droughty trees were related to building loss. However, more influential than that was bare ground. Okay. What we're seeing a lot in Eden is a lot of homes that were lost. The trees near them were only scorched on the side facing the home. So it's really interesting because it really goes against everything we've been doing and taught, where we should get rid of trees that are near homes, whereas in the case of Altadena, and again, this is just my speculating, right? We still don't have the data, is that it didn't really seem to have made a difference whether the tree was overhanging the home. Again, there was litter that could have been an issue in the house being lost. We saw cypress trees, and I showed you a picture that were of them being located right next to homes. No issue there. So again, this is just me speculating that in these wind-driven fires, it's the embers that's going to determine what gets lost, right? Not the type of vegetation. And then secondly, it's probably moisture that plays an influence there. But this is the issue, right? That's the problem we have here, is that a lot of insurances are requesting homeowners to remove overhanging trees. We recommend, right, a lot of trees near your homes for all the benefits. So what's that sweet spot? We don't know. That's what we're trying to figure out.
Yeah, we have a couple questions on bare ground. So one is, bare ground was influential in what way? And the other is, are you saying bare ground had less damage or more damage?
Okay, so let me explain a little bit what that, remember it was trees, shrubs, herbaceous, low density trees, high density trees, and then we had this category buildings and bare ground. So bare ground could be anything. It could be bare soil, it could be chips, it could be litter, it could be asphalt, it could be pavement. Okay, so we're not exactly sure what that bare ground, but that bare ground in zone 0 was the most influential in being correlated with the loss of that home. It could have been a wood deck also. That's the other thing, right?
Then let's see. Is the urban tree shrub flammability study available to review? And the next is the data available to the public if we wanted to apply to map them on ArcGIS?
So I think that's two different. So the plant flammability study, we took representative urban trees and shrubs from Northern California, Southern. We tested them in the forest products lab, and the results are being written up. So that's not available. The other data, we used those trees we're measuring were identified with the county's tree inventory. So trees that were measured, inventoried, those are the ones we tracked down, and now we're measuring for fire effects. We'll monitor into the future. So the tree inventory is available. Our data will probably be available once we kind of look through it a little bit and analyze and publish it, and it goes through peer review.
Robin says these are such vital statistics to get out to municipal and insurance regulators. It's more of a comment, but that's very important, I think, as well. And then Greg says hydration is one of the most important determinants of fire resistance. This came out of a 4-year study Dr. John Keeley and I conducted for the US Navy. Is anyone looking at the aerodynamics of wind-driven fires?
So one here in the LA area, I've identified, I've heard about 2 or 3 different groups that are trying to look at this question of whether trees act as filters for embers. So that's kind of directly related to the question. The issue again, with trees, there's always kind of that trade-off, right? The trees produce litter, and they are fuels. So we saw a couple of examples in Altadena where trees seem to have caught some embers, but then when you looked at the backside of those trees where the homes were, there was a lot of litter on the roof. Surprisingly, those homes weren't damaged by fire. So it brings up a lot of questions, right? What role does the wind dynamics in these fires? What does it play, and what causes the ember to land in a certain situation, ignite the house, and not ignite it in another? So, as far as I know, though, it's some folks from UCLA. I think they're looking at that. But again, this area of looking at fires and the relationship between buildings and vegetations, that's not something that's been studied a lot, as opposed to wildland urban interface and wildland fires and structural fires.
Greg, did you want to elaborate a little bit on that?
Oh, thank you. So I've been kind of involved in this issue since the late 90s, and we've had about 25. We've experienced like 25 major and minor fire events in our landscapes, and knock wood, we haven't lost a single house yet. And we did a 4-year study, myself and Dr. John Keeley, on looking at fire resistance in native landscapes, because the Navy was real curious about these results since they managed tens of thousands of acres of naval housing right up against the WUI. And what we found was that there is a very strong, consistent correlation between vegetation hydration and rate of fire spread, and a few other variables we looked at. And it also showed that thinning, like 40 to 50% thinning of chaparral canopy, was quite effective as well. But I'm an old aerospace engineer, and it was interesting to me that these people, like in Witch Fire, Cedar Fire, people had cleared for hundreds of feet around their house. The house was like a pile of ash and a chimney, often surrounded by green queen palms or green grass, And so what we realized was that when you clear all vegetation, the mineral soil, you've basically created laminar flow, or a wind tunnel, if you would. And the only thing to actually perturb these ferocious, dry, ember-laden winds is your house, right? There's just nothing there to create turbulence, to create ember catching and cooling. And over again, we would see with the native vegetation that things would often singe, but not really develop a lot of radiant heat. The plants were perfectly okay. It wouldn't burn like wooden decks in the back and things like that. And I realized that I think it's important that we kind of look at the aerodynamics of what's going on. So, you know, as an aerospace engineer, what can I say? But I think there's really, I'm so glad to hear you talking in terms of wind-driven versus fuel-driven fires. And I can also tell you from experience that for us, zone 0 really worked. Those aprons around the house, excluding vegetation in front of the eaves, made a big difference. And the last thing I want to say, I love your presentation, by the way. The last thing that I wanted to say was that John Keeley did a study after the witch fire. He found that one of the most determinant factors of whether a house would burn, and you'll probably agree with this, was whether there was debris on the roof. How much debris had collected on the roof. And I thought that was pretty fascinating. So anyway, thanks for getting my reaction. I appreciate it.
Thank you. One last quick comment. You know, the other thing, Greg, was wooden fences. At least from my observation, everywhere you
I was going to say that too.
Yeah. You know, the other thing that we're just scratching our heads, Greg, when we walk around these homes, you see them just like that Arbor Day picture I showed you, just vegetation, dry vegetation, eucalyptus, and the home's intact. And the home next to it is gone. Like, no logic, no everything we kind of thought about is kind of the model of why homes are lost. And we have a huge, you know, thousands of homes or something. And you just see this pattern after pattern, right? That's
pattern, right? And
there
John, actually,
completely random.
I wanted to mention, John used to live in Altadena.
Oh,
and his home was completely surrounded by hydrated trees, and it didn't burn. It was one of the few that didn't. And he really hadn't given it a thought about it, you know, that just happened to be surrounded by these trees. But after working with him and talking to him, he thought, God. And then he showed me a picture from the Paradise Fire of this big, beautiful house that was completely intact, again, surrounded by hydrated trees. And then just beyond the trees, you could see just nothing but rubble everywhere. And you know, it needs to be the right trees. We love the natives because it takes so little water to hydrate them, and they hang on to the water, you know, contrary to popular belief. But it's the hydration, you know. I'm not going to say the unmodified chaparral, unwatered chaparral is going to protect a home. But if you can create these green belts, you know.
But again, it's maintenance, right? It's tree maintenance. It's pruning, removing litter.
So much
watering,
of it.
Right.
Maintaining the separation between understory and bottom branches, that kind of thing.
Pruning, right.
Thank you. Great presentation.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm muted. Okay, we have a couple more questions. Any comment on the Army Corps of Engineers in LA condemning savable trees and local pushback efforts that was in the newspaper recently?
Yeah, so that's been a real thorny issue. So these measurements we've been doing, we've been noticing that, yes, a lot of the trees that were perfectly fine, slightly scorched, they dropped their leaves because of the heat. They're coming out now. They were designated as hazard trees when they probably shouldn't have. We've seen a lot of other trees that should have been designated as hazard trees that weren't. But I think the reality here is just given the magnitude of this, there's people coming from all over the country working on this. They're not used to these species. It was leaf off. It was, you know, early January when all this happened. So I think they were trying their best, but it's just, I don't think you could bring enough people with have the skills to be able to identify those trees and are familiar with how these trees respond. We don't know how these trees respond to fire. So I think there's just a lot of lack of information. That's what we're trying to address. Because all the information, for example, for what to do with fire damaged trees comes from wildland areas, conifer trees, oak trees. What do you do with a crepe myrtle, an elm, different types of hedges, ficus. We don't know how they react or don't react to fire. So hopefully with this data, if I'm still around in a couple of months or years, we'll be able to kind of look for those trends and response and come up with these guidelines, at least by tree type. How much scorch does it take to kill off a tree? How much scorch can a tree take and it still respond, right? And live into the future.
And then just a couple more questions on the bare ground. I think there's some clarification wanted here. So the first is bare ground. It's a question. So more bare ground means more loss of the home? Question mark.
Yes. So statistically speaking, homes that had more bare ground were destroyed.
And then bare ground also includes like areas that are asphalt or
Yes,
decks.
yeah. Driveways, asphalt, bare soil, gravel, litter, right? So as we researchers love to say, future research, right? We really need to focus on that bare ground. What was it about that bare ground that was highly influential in the homes being lost?
And then the final question I think on this is, did bare ground include low vegetation like ice plants or ground covers?
No, I think that would have come out in our that would have been under herbaceous vegetation type. So we would have the images would have placed that into vegetation type. So no, bare ground is non-vegetated, right? Everything else that's non-vegetated, that's not a building or not vegetation. So it's pretty broad.
Yeah. And then this is a question essentially for Greg as well. When we say wind driven, how strong of miles per hour are these winds? And where is the change from wind to fuel driven?
You asking me, Greg?
Essentially, yeah.
Yeah, well, yeah, because you're seeing, and you often get these Venturi effects, because they're coming down canyons. And honestly, the fire up there in Eaton, the houses were so close together. They were built so long ago, long before, fire optimization. And the vegetation surrounding the community was so dry and so full of weeds, which are also flashy fuel fire carrier. And so I think they were hitting between, 60 and 90 miles an hour. It was insane. And, at that point, you can't even do beyond zone 1 in those closely packed homes. So, it's just going from house to house to house. But like I cited in John's case, he had these hydrated trees all around the home and it didn't burn. And we saw this over and over repeatedly because I go in after the fires, interview my clients, interview the poor neighbors that burned down and stuff. So yeah, these are some ferocious winds.
You know what? One of the things we also saw that a lot of these trees that were designated as hazardous, that a lot of people were complaining about, were damaged from the wind, not necessarily the fire, but they were wind damaged, right? So a lot of limbs were hanging, dangling. So that's why they were designated as hazard, not because they were fire affected, because they were wind affected from the winds. So a wind, not a lot, but there was some wind throw. Some large trees were on the ground pre-fire or during the event.
And then Henry Herrera from CAL FIRE says, one thing to keep in mind is that the two previous winters were extremely wet. Results may have differed if the fires occurred during drought years, depending on which urban trees are watered and which are not. And then we also have a question here on the native trees. So are you saying that native trees aren't going to provide, let's see here, as good of, hydrated native trees doesn't guarantee higher protections.
So hopefully the data will show that, but we didn't see any species level differences. Just broadly speaking, if they were well maintained, well irrigated, regardless, native, non-native, those seem to have done better in general.
And let's see, how will these bare ground findings affect zone 0?
So that's what we're scratching our heads. That's, from the insurance implications of it, the defensible space zone regulation of it, that, what homeowners want. That's the, what is it? $1 million question.
And finally, Rob, Ilko says he encourages everybody to participate in the Department of Forestry Zone Zero workshop in April to change the board's draft regulations of zero vegetation. Thank you so much, Francisco. That was like very enlightening. Quite a lot of questions as well. Okay, at this point, we're going to turn over to John Morgan from CAL FIRE. He's going to be discussing the rationale behind defensible space regulations. Let me make sure we got you unmuted here, John. I just remuted you as soon as you unmuted.
That's kind of how it works usually. So, it'd be a good discussion, especially after this previous one, because I'm going to advocate for fair ground within 5 feet of your house and, and defensible space. But you know, to stay on topic, and you asked me to talk about the rationale behind defensible space regulation. And I think a lot of times people are unaware at how much research really goes into it. So in the chat just a little while ago, and I can put it in there again, but I put a link to the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety website, specifically their wildfire research section. And I heard it mentioned that there hasn't been a lot of research in this. I would say, however, that there actually has been. I really encourage you to go through a lot of that website, especially there on the wildfire side, and read some of the documentation that IBHS has been able to put out. In fact, most recent document is on the LA fires here in January. So really good information. I would say that somebody that has their microphone unmuted and it's coming back to me. So with that, we're just going to dive right in and happy to answer questions regarding the research that you'll see on the IBHS site. Just for context, CAL FIRE does contract with IBHS to perform much of that research, along with other entities like UL Laboratories and NIST and others. But getting back to the topic you asked me to talk about. So based on research that we conduct or have conducted in facilities, we come back and we talk about, hey, how do our regulations stack up to what we're seeing in the laboratory? And I'll talk about a few things here. One of them, what's the definition of defensible space? Another is just, I'll kind of quickly touch on a few of our codes and regulations that influence and or mandate defensible space. First one being Public Resources Code 4119.
We're having some audio issues again here. Let's see, there's a bit of some feedback and some echo.
Yeah, and there's no one, everyone is unmuted, is muted, so that's not the issue. And so there's probably a microphone at on your level, John, if you want to log out and back in again, or if you want to check if you're on any kind of a Bluetooth, you're going to hit fuzziness, so you need to be speaking directly into a microphone.
Sure. Yeah, I can put that in for you.
Why don't you go back out again, and then I would suggest, Megan, you put back on that Britain one-pager just to walk through people, because it really has, it's such a good one to send to anybody with doubt. Just to use the time that we have here, or just ask some more questions.
All right. Say, how do you hear me right about now?
I think much better.
Is that so I'll start sharing my screen again. I wonder if it has something to do with this screen share thing.
It
It's
shouldn't.
odd. You're absolutely right. It should not.
It's
But
being, it's
since
great.
I've
It's
been
shared right
rambling on
now.
here, correct. Since I've been rambling on here, how's the audio been?
Much better.
Okay. So, contrary to popular belief, it turns out my Bluetooth headset works better than the microphone sitting in front of me. So, with that, we'll just kind of jump into the defensible space definition. You know, it's really just a buffer that you're trying to create, and there is a bit of a misnomer that a lot of times people think CAL FIRE want citizens to clear all vegetation and create this kind of moonscape landscape around their homes, and that's just simply not the case. But CAL FIRE does recommend thinning, which we talked about a little while ago. We do recommend spacing, properly spacing and things of that nature. And also talking about that wind tunnel effect that we heard about a little while ago, having vegetation obviously helps with that. And there's certainly plenty of data to show that vegetation isn't the only issue. And obviously having vegetation for not only for habitat, for aesthetic reasons, but also for that screening opportunity. And there was a word mentioned earlier, properly maintained. And I really like that phrase because, you know, so many people started to go down these roads of, oh, what's a vegetation that I should have around my home or should not have? You know, is there a list of volatile species and that type of thing? And really what it comes down to is we can burn an ice plant, and that's full of water. You know, it's really not so much about the exact species as it is that maintenance that you mentioned earlier and spacing and islanding of vegetation around your structure. Now, back in the early days, defensible space was so that homes that caught on fire would not spread to the wildland. Today, we understand that it works both directions, right? So we've kind of adjusted our scope or our view of defensible space. You realize that our first defensible space regulation went into the Public Resource Code in 1964 and then was updated to basically what you see now in 1965. It's been around for a long time. So in looking at that, just about authority and that type of thing. So just wanted to point out that in Public Resource Code 4119, that tells us as a department that CAL FIRE can and shall enforce state forest and fire laws. You know, outside of the fact that it tells us that we shall enforce, I'd point out that it says we may inspect. So it doesn't say we shall inspect. And that's why you see that CAL FIRE doesn't necessarily make it to every single structure every single year. We do have an internal goal to get around to all of the structures in a certain number of years. You know, about like every 3 years, we'd like to get around to all properties with structures. But it's a may rather than a shall. Something else to think about there is through that authority, Public Resource Code 4291 was created. And, you know, in the early days, it wasn't so much laboratory testing that influenced this, this law, but it was the commonality of structure loss versus forest fire ignitions from structures that kind of thought that spurred that thought process of defensible space. And so one of the purposes behind it obviously is to protect the forest, but also to protect structures. And in the grand scheme of things, and most importantly, it's to reduce public and firefighter fatalities. Having that buffer gives people time to react to incoming fires. It also gives firefighters a fighting chance, a buffer, if you will, or a clearer space for them to fight fire with less fuel and less fire intensity. And so we've seen better results during firefighting activities for firefighters and citizens alike, where they have that buffer, where crowning fires that are 200 and 300 foot tall flame lengths coming through forest, as the fire hits that thinned area, not moonscape, but thinned area of defensible space, it brings that fire down from that extreme level that we cannot do anything about to a ground level fire that we can now fight with ground resources, with firefighters, and citizens can effectively escape from. So that's kind of the purpose behind that defensible space. Some of that goes into, hey, these zones. And of course, we're very familiar with zone 1 and 2. That's the first 30 and then the additional 70 feet to equal a 100-foot buffer around a structure. These days, however, we're talking about zone 0, a new zone, an ember-resistant zone. And some of the discussion before, it's very interesting to hear about that bare surface, but included in bare surface, it sounded to me like wooden decks, potentially wooden bark mulch, landscaping mulches. I heard the word debris or leaves and litter, things of that nature, being potentially included in there. And I would just say that our studies have shown through science-based investigation and experiments that wooden bark, leaves, litter, pine needles near the house, up within that 5 feet, actually catches a lot of embers, and those embers smolder in that vegetative material and then end up influencing fire behavior right next to the house. Additionally, if you saw in that one picture where it showed the fence materials, the cross members were there, and right where the cross members, there was a post going down and then a lower cross member, and right where those items met, it was all burned out. That is because, and I can say this with confidence because we've done the experiments, that is because embers collected there at that place where the wooden members join together. And then they start to smolder there in those nooks and crannies. And as they do that, that's why it starts to burn out around that joint. Now, if you think about a wooden deck, it's nothing but wooden joints perpendicular to each other. And so it's an interesting phenomenon and a really great photo that you posted that shows that correlation. Now, when you go to that website, the link there in the chat, there's a specific study that we did about decking around homes. And decking has proven to be one of the very influential items. And so California Building Code, specifically in Chapter 7A, has changed so that you now need non-combustible material 6 inches from the surface of the deck up to the bottom of the structure siding. Also, the area underneath the deck cannot have any debris, leaves, pine needles, litter, 2x4s, things that we store under there, old paint cans and things of that nature. You can't have ignition sources around a deck because they, if you've ever built a fire, how do you build a fire? You stack lumber in opposite directions and then light it, and it burns really great. And so this is basically what we've done with the design of our decking around our homes. So I do encourage you to take a look at some of those studies and learn about the way that corresponds to home ignition. So Title 14 of the California Code of Regulations, I mentioned just a moment ago, Public Resource Code 4291, that's the authority behind defensible space. That's basically the law that says you shall have defensible space. And then the California Code of Regulations 1299 is the how. We heard that we shall, but now how? And so the intent of this regulation is to provide guidance for the implementation of Public Resource Code 4291. It talks about all of the zones and what can and cannot be within those zones. Now, right now, this is it's worth noting that this regulation out of Title 14 is promulgated by the Board of Forestry, not by CAL FIRE. CAL FIRE is Public Resources Code, while Title 14, 1299 is the Board of Forestry. And so they promulgate these regulations in Title 14. And right now, they are going through a Zone 0 regulation process. It's really great that it was mentioned next Monday on the 7th at the California Natural Resources Building in Sacramento. There will be a public meeting. There's also a virtual option there. So feel free to go to the Board of Forestry's website and register for that event and definitely have your voice heard. With the mention of Public Resource Code 4291 and defensible space, it's oftentimes misconstrued as being part of Public Resource Code 4290. And I know I'm throwing a lot of numbers out, but that was the ask. So it's important to note that Public Resource Code 4290 actually deals with new structures and that development of structures in the state responsibility areas. And so it's a little bit different. Yes, there are some defensible space components to it, but really it's about construction in the wildland-urban interface or state responsibility area. And then to kind of wrap up here, I just wanted to point out some of the things we want to avoid, right? So we want to avoid devastating damage to our communities, to our fire departments, to our homes. And as we see more and more structures damaged, we start to learn more and more about how and why it was damaged. So the more we learn about that, the better we can inform our decisions while we're going through regulatory process to update our laws, codes, and regulations. This is what we want to see, right? We want to see, and this is a great example of CAL FIRE is not asking for moonscape. CAL FIRE is not asking for every single piece of vegetation to be removed. And these are extremely good examples of that. Both of these show you, both of these angles show you that vegetation isn't necessarily the evil item that sometimes people think CAL FIRE is trying to convey. What we're trying to say is the proper maintenance, spacing, islanding, pruning, thinning of vegetation is paramount to a home's survival. And with that, I'm open for questions.
Thank you, John. We do have some questions. I can scroll up here. So first we have a comment from Greg. It says Zone 0 was something implemented as far back as 1998. Although there are different points of view in our experience, it kept flames from directly reaching the eaves and raiding against the walls. Even though I work with natives, I was in agreement with Zone 0 designation. Charles says, I wonder if we need to prepare for two kinds of fire with different strategies, wind-driven versus embers in a fuel, RE, embers in a fuel-driven where direct fire attacks the house.
Yeah, while you look there, I'll just make a comment on that one. I really encourage to look at some of the research we did through the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety. That link I put in the chat a little while ago. There's an ember cast study in there, and some of the photos are just absolutely stunning. As you see the ember generator just showering embers on this house, they actually hit the side of the house and they kind of bounce around within that first 5-foot zone. And they and so that's sort of how we came up with that 5-foot area, and or reassured or reaffirmed that that first 5 feet is so vitally important, especially when we're talking about a wind-driven, ember cast dominated fire, where we're seeing so much devastation and destruction in homes that are a mile, 2 miles away from the fire. We're not talking about direct flame impingement from the main body. It's of the fire. And so that's a really great point to bring up, and some really good studies for you to see there at the website.
Anne says, this is from PRC 4291, and the implications are that trees are removed in subdivisions. What is science-based and realistic? Remove the portion of tree that extends within 10 feet of the outlet, or a chimney or stove pipe. So stove pipe.
Yeah. So the portion of 4291 that was just quoted is branches that extend within 10 feet of a chimney, right? So we can fully expect heat and embers to come from a chimney. And so really that is actually, it's really focused on stopping ignition of that vegetation from a fire that you intentionally built in your fireplace. So that's the point of that particular quote. However, talking about tree limbs around a structure, CAL FIRE recommends that you prune back vegetation such as tree limbs, especially dead and dying tree limbs. If you see as you go through there, you're going to see a lot of verbiage around dead and dying. Now, we can fully expect that lush, well-maintained green vegetation is going to have a fuel moisture that it would actually be beneficial. But dead and dying vegetation, this is something we can we can, I think, all come in, to agreement on that. It poses a fuel moisture slash ignition issue. And so I do encourage that all dead and dying branches be removed from trees and vegetation around all portions of homes and decking. But that specific one was related to chimneys.
Thank you. We have a question. What do you mean by thinning? People use that terms to mean several different things.
Yeah, that's a great point. And on our website, readyforwildfire.org, there's actually guidance documents there for vegetation thinning and pruning as it relates to defensible space. It talks about things like fuel height and density so that you can understand, based on your situation on your property, how best to plan your vegetation management. And sometimes that's a tough term for people to hear, but we do have to think about not only the benefits of the vegetation around our homes, but also the potential hazard. And so proper spacing and thinning are paramount. So those documents, it's going to be different for every single person's house. So it's really difficult for me to say, well, you need to do X, Y, Z, and then you'll be perfectly good, right? And it also would determine or be determined based on the type of trees you have, right? So fruit trees are going to be pruned and or thinned differently than conifers, differently than oaks, differently. And so it really comes down to your specific circumstances.
Marco has a comment here. He also works for CAL FIRE. Structure fires have changed since the 50s due to the materials and finishes for construction. Chemical compounds and materials used in construction play a huge role in structure fires. Multiple variables affect the outcome of fires and structures.
Yeah, you know, since
And
2010, it's a great point that the structures and their building materials have definitely changed. In 2010, well, really 2008, we enacted a new section to the building code called Chapter 7A, and that's ignition resistant building construction as it relates to structures that are typically found in a wildland urban interface or even wildland urban intermix situation, meaning kind of those edge of the city or out in the country types of homes that you would find in most of the time in a high or a very high fire hazard severity zone. And using ignition resistant construction works in both directions, in fact, meaning it does help prevent against external fire and those embercast ignitions, but it also we recently did a structure separation study, and the stucco and or concrete sided homes, actually, when we ignited the interior of the structure, it protected those exterior non-combustible siding components, actually protected the structures next door, until, of course, the structural members failed. And then, you know, at that point, the walls are falling down. And so it's a little different. But, you know, to look at that, and then you get into all of the different, you know, we moved away from cotton and got into polyurethanes and you know, other materials that aren't so much natural components. And so, of course, they burn differently.
I have a question here about the enforcing fire laws and concerns that since COVID, not as much enforcement is getting done, even if reported. So how can everybody support so everybody complies and does not become a hazard for their neighbors?
Yeah, so that's an interesting, I haven't actually heard that, but I can tell you, I run the Defensible Space program for
Frozen, John.
met and exceeded our inspection goals of over 250,000 inspections every year. And we actually have done more inspections and made more public face-to-face contacts in the last 3 years than we've ever done in the past. To answer the second part of that, sorry about that. I think it's a really great question. How can we support or have support so everybody complies and not become a hazard for our neighbors? Interestingly, defensible space is not an option. If you look at Public Resource Code 4291 in the very opening charging statement, it says all property owners in the state responsibility area shall maintain defensible space. This is a lot like the speed limit. So it's not a matter of, well, I didn't see the speed limit sign, officer, so I shouldn't be held to the rules. It's actually every homeowner's law-abiding responsibility to follow defensible space regulations at all times. Now, we know on the highways, not all speeders get caught, right? And in a very similar way, I only have 146 inspectors throughout the entire state. So in a similar way, we can't enforce on every single non-compliant property because we simply do not have the personnel, just like CHP simply does not have enough officers to catch everyone breaking the speed limit. So.
Thank you, John. That was very insightful. At this point, I'm going to turn it over and start our panel discussion. Thank you so much. So we are talking to our regional fire representatives here in San Diego County today. Before we start this section, I do just want to let you know that after this panel discussion, we will be asking anyone who is looking to get their CEUs for the ISA to enter their certification number and full name in the chat. But we do want to get through this portion before we ask you to do so to ensure that you're getting all the information from today's webinar. Oops. All right, so let me introduce Marcy Garcia, the Code Compliance Supervisor from the City of San Diego Fire Department, and Chief Eric Just with CAL FIRE and the County of San Diego Fire Protection District. Instead of the Q&A feature, just go ahead and put any questions that you may have right into the general chat, and we'll be monitoring that like we have for the last few presentations. But let me go ahead and turn it over to Marcy Garcia.
Hi, thank you. My name is Marcy Garcia. I'm a Senior Code Compliance Supervisor over our wildland enforcement section of the San Diego Fire Department. John, you did a great presentation on defining what defensible space is, so I'm not going to really go into that. I'll just jump into what our city landscape, the city of San Diego's landscape brush management ordinance, which is the San Diego Municipal Code 1420412, which it does require 100 feet of defensible space. And it is broken down into two zones, currently Zone 1 and Zone 2. However, we will in the future be integrating Zone 0 which is the ember resistant zone. And basically in that, kind of like what John explained, all this that why is that important is that most homes lost to wildfires are ignited by excuse me, flying embers. So when we go out there, we'll assess the home and do our defensible space inspections. We'll start from the house to zone 1 and then out forward. And then currently right now, because the city of San Diego does not have a code for zone 0, is all on recommendations. And that's what we're currently doing with zone 0. But for zone 1, what we look for in zone 1, so in no trees, we planted a minimum of 10 feet from the structure, and then regularly trim trees to maintain a 10-foot gap between others. So if you have trees, multiple trees in zone 1, we try to get it so that there is a separation there. And then remove branches that hang over the roof and keep branches 10 feet away from your child, as explained, as John had explained. And then we look for all dead plants, grass, and weeds, and then remove any dead, dried leaves, pine from the gutters, the yard, or anywhere. Excuse me. And then we'll move to zone 2. Zone 2 is where your native and naturalized vegetation is, and there is where you selectively thin and prune up to 50%. And this is to reduce the fuel load there, so that if there is a fire, that there is time for the fire department to respond, and also for you to take all the stuff that you need to go. And then for trees in zone 2, of course, we would remove the distressed, diseased, dead, dying trees, and thin and prune the remaining larger trees and shrubs. So if there's a shrub underneath the tree, then you would cut 3 times the height of a shrub, or 6 feet, which is ever greater. And then we keep the annual grasses down to 2 inches, and then also that we remove invasive plants that could spread, and fallen needles and broken branches in the area. Okay, so let me go here.
Yeah, this is Ann.
Pretty
Thank
much
you.
what we do.
Just a real quick question. Can you go back and address that question about really having every part of a tree being 10 feet away, and what that does to our landscaping in our cities? So if you can help us with that right now, since that's back in the middle of what you're covering. Thank you.
Right. Well, for myself, I'm not the authors of the code. I'm more in the enforcers. So the science behind, I'm sure that all the codes are directed from a science-based information. But John, maybe you want to jump in again.
Hi, are we talking about the spacing requirement?
Is that
Yeah, we're talking about saying that all parts of a canopy need to be 10 feet away from a roof line or even a chimney. That would make it, in most of our subdivisions, that all trees would be gone because we're so tight. And yet what we've been talking about is that these trees are not igniting the houses. So maybe the question isn't to defend it right now, but is to say, what is it that we might, from the science standpoint, want to be working on making a different requirement, so that we don't lose all of our trees in our neighborhoods when insurance companies want to enforce this.
Yeah, interestingly, I hear you loud and clear on the tree discussion. It was mentioned a little bit earlier about wooden fences, and it's funny because we actually lose more structures because of wooden fence lines between structures and in urban areas like you're describing than we do from the trees themselves, mainly because we've separated the main body of the fire, the vegetation fire. We've begun to separate that, and now it's transitioning into an urban fire. And this was discussed a little bit early on in this meeting, but it becomes sort of a different beast when you transition from a true vegetation fire and go into an urban, what's known as conflagration. And so I completely hear you on the need for additional research on those trees. I would say, though, that our early findings, and I would say from historic findings of School of Hard Knocks and experience, is that where we can, we should limit the amount of vegetation right next to the structure, because if it does catch on fire, and we have, I also run the damage inspection program for CAL FIRE. So that data that was displayed earlier and mentioned in the chat, that's actually data that comes from my office. And so what we do see is that when combustible items are near the house, you're going to see additional damage. Now, whether or not that's directly from the vegetation, or once the house catches on fire in an urban conflagration situation, that house oftentimes will hit that vegetation with direct flame impingement or radiant heat, catch it on fire, and the fire will move that way. But fencing acts literally like a wick around structures. And we've seen where small grass fires that seemed innocent enough were actually exacerbated by it ignited the fencing and then burned up to the house, burned the first house down, catches the fence on fire, burns the next house down, so on and so forth.
I get the fencing part. Maybe what I'm asking for, is there enough science that we just talked about for an entire hour to say the trees and the roof need to have a different regulation, or literally our insurance companies will have people taking out all their trees? So maybe that's what I'm looking for, is, are we ready to take a look at the science behind that, so that this, which doesn't make sense, can have a different approach? So that's what I'm asking.
Getting down to the science, when you dive into the IBHS website that I posted on there, you'll see some experiments that they have conducted regarding that fuel spacing. And you'll notice that in their certification program, they have decided that no branches can be within 10 feet of the house, and no branches can overhang the house or a deck. Now, CAL FIRE hasn't taken that stance. And to my knowledge, looking at the recently published Zone 0 language from the last public meeting in February, and you can go to the Board of Forestry's website and see that language. It does not talk about removing all branches up to 10 feet away from the house and overhanging. It talks about mature trees being left in Zone 0 if they meet certain criteria for height and density. So I don't think, based on the public information that I've seen from the Board of Forestry on their Zone 0 regulation, that they're suggesting currently this 10-foot buffer that you're mentioning.
So hopefully you'll come with some clarification, because that's clearly, that's not what the insurance companies are using. So anyway, thank you for addressing that. I think could be an important outcome of today's meeting.
Yeah, I think you bring up a great point, that insurance industry, mind you, it's an industry. They don't have to follow CAL FIRE or the Board of Forestry's recommendations or guidelines. What they do have to follow are the California Department of Insurance guidelines and regulations. So they would have to base their decisions based on California Department of Insurance guidelines. And they do have a vegetation management regulation, and that is what insurance companies have, but they don't have to necessarily take into account Public Resource Code 4291 when they're doing that. They have to follow the insurance regulations.
Yeah.
Maybe in the interest of time, Marcia can finish her presentation because we also have two other panelists, and then this is the kind of conversation that should happen after the panelists present.
Gotcha.
No, that's fine. And also too, when we go out and do a defensible space inspection, we will look at the trees and try to mitigate it. So we're not going to make people remove trees. We're going to try to mitigate the existing trees so that it will reduce the risk. That's what our goal is. But just like John said, the insurance companies can make the homeowners remove trees. We can't based on our guidelines, but they can keep their insurance. So there's two different things there. But as far as we will try to mitigate as much as we can, so we're not going out there to having people remove trees. That's all I have. If anybody has questions, I'll.
Thank you. We'll turn it over real quick to Chief Eric Just, and then we will start the question portion of the panel.
Good morning, everyone. I guess it's still morning, right? Yeah, 11 o'clock. So yeah, I didn't have a presentation. I thought what I would do is just add some remarks just from my perspective. I've been in San Diego County for 10 years now. I run our pre-fire division. I'm also the unit forester here. And, I want to start out by saying, structure loss in San Diego County is nothing new. I mean, the Eaton fire and the Palisades fire obviously brings it to the forefront again, but we've been dealing with this situation for a long time. I mean, we obviously all still probably remember the 2003 fire siege. We lost over 2,000 homes here in San Diego County. So kind of the same problem. I don't think there's anything new. But I think there's been a lot of good information shared today. And I guess from my perspective, I think it's really important to distinguish between, your typical fires and your wind-driven fires. Absolutely two different categories, probably similar to the Midwest where, you've got winds and then you've got tornadoes, two entirely separate situations. And so, with weather prediction and whatnot, we're usually pretty well aware of like an offshore wind event that's building and that will eventually occur. I mean, we can just watch the weather in the Midwest. If you get a cold front in the winter there, guaranteed within 2 or 3 days, we're going to be having offshore winds here. So two kind of different situations. When you're dealing with a fire in the wildland, it's threatening houses. In typical situations, a lot of the embers are going up, and they'll float around and they'll eventually come down, and it's not entirely a huge threat from a from a structure loss perspective. But when you have the offshore wind events and you get a start and you get something going inside of a community, embers play probably the biggest factor in that situation. And if you go back and you look at news feeds of helicopters flying around and they're filming fires that are moving through communities, what you see is a lot is fires established in the attic spaces. And so to me, the key there is the penetration of the embers eventually into the attic space. And what do we talk about in that situation? Well, we're starting to talk about home hardening and vent size and different things like that. But once a fire gets established in the attic space it's pretty much going to be a loss. I mean, there's not a whole lot that can be done, especially when you've got all these other threats that are happening all at the same time. So, I think defensible space plays a huge role in probably 95% of our fire situations, and it's super effective. But I think we need to separate we talk a lot about the offshore winds and, the Santa Ana wind events. totally different situation. I don't even expect our fuel breaks to work in those situations. So, I do a lot of fuel break work, and, those are designed and planned for, 90% of the weather that we could encounter where we'd have a vegetation fire. So, and we've been pretty lucky since the 2000, time frame. And I think a lot of that can be contributed to, public education, a lot of efforts that have gone on, trying to educate the public, because we just don't want to have, nonsense situations occur, like whatever, grinding metal during, hot part of the day. And I think people have understood that at this point. So, it's really hard to pinpoint. We haven't had a huge fire like that since 2003. So, I mean, how do you measure your success with public outreach when there aren't any fires really to measure? I guess it is successful in that regard, just because we haven't had that situation. So, but since the 2003 fires, the county's taken it really seriously, and we've really built up our programs here. We've got a real dynamite aircraft program here, and so we've got early alert systems and all these things that were factors during the 2003 fires that over the last many years we've put into place, so that we're going to be more effective when we get that situation. So as far as trees and being a forester, we do a lot of prescribed burning too, and trees in and of themselves, they do play a role. You've got the big culprits like the Mexican fan palms that are just no-goes. You get fire established in one of those, they're just gonna, of course, go up in flames. But a lot of trees, they require some kind of surface fire underneath them to actually get them going. I mean, I see aftermath photos. And oftentimes you'll see a lot of the, and these are more in the Sierras and whatnot. We don't have a lot of, obviously, forested areas here in San Diego County, but, trees don't appear to be like the real big factor. It's the trees getting scorched from the houses that are actually catching on fire and burning. So, absent of surface fuels, I don't know if trees are really going to catch on fire. But when you combine that with surface fuels that are on fire, then you've got, you pretty much got a pretty tall fuel bed when you add trees on top of that. And so, trees are like the big ember cast situation. And so they can loft embers great distances. And so embers really become the enemy in those high wind situations. And, that's just kind of what I've seen. I mean, our last, I'm thinking Alpine, maybe in 2019, we had 35 structures that were lost. I can't think of a lot that's occurred over the last several years. We had some fires out in the East County. I remember maybe 4 years ago that started at night during an offshore wind event. I think there were a few structures that ended up getting bumped, and might have had some damage, but nothing major. Now, I got wood all around me. I'm knocking on it right now. So my hope is hopefully we can avoid, this Palisades and Eaton situation as we move forward. So that was kind of my remarks, and I guess if there's questions, I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Yes, we're going to start the question portion of the panel now. We did have the Resource Conservation District scheduled, but they unfortunately weren't able to make it, just to let participants know. So I guess I'll start. I have a question about the spacing between crowns of new trees and adjacent trees not being closer than 10 feet. If it's not within 10 feet or, not near a structure, what is the reasoning behind that? And is that being enforced with new plantings?
Is that question for me?
Yeah, who's it to?
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, that's for the counties. That's in the county's consolidated fire code.
So yeah, I mean, from a fire code perspective, I mean, I'm aware of these codes. Can you ask that question once again? Because we've got a whole department that kind of deals with the defensible space inspections, and here in the county we have a very robust defensible space program. I know for us we have well over 100,000, if I can remember correctly, 100,000 properties within the county that fall into our fire response jurisdiction that have one or more structures on them, and our attempt is to visit each one of those structures within every 3 years. But you want to rephrase that question? Maybe I'll give it a shot.
Yeah, so it says trees within the 50-foot zone of a structure, new trees that are planted, they should be maintained so that the tree's drip line at maturity is a minimum of 10 feet. Oh, wait, that's the wrong one. From any structure, but the horizontal distance between crowns of new trees and adjacent trees shall not be less than 10 feet.
Well, yeah, and your question is that a good thing or a bad thing, or
It's basically, is that being enforced? My interpretation of that is that tree canopies cannot be touching more than 10 feet. They have to be within 10 feet. Like there's got to be spacing 10 feet between individual tree canopies. Is that what the code is saying?
yeah, I mean that would make sense because what you're trying to do is isolate, ignition sources. If you have a collection of trees all together, I think they're more vulnerable from going up. So it makes sense to me that would be required. John, I don't know, maybe you have something more to add on that.
Nothing in particular for the county itself in that particular situation, but anytime we can move away from the canopy within 100 feet of a structure, preface, when we can move away from continuous canopy situations, it helps us get out of a running crown fire in the trees, which brings the fire down to the ground and allows ground crews to effectively put the fire out. When we're dealing with flame heights, let's say your tree is 50 feet high, and typically you're going to have flames that are going above that. We could be talking about 60 to 75-foot flame lengths, and the radiant heat alone would preclude firefighters on the ground from being able to be close enough to effectively manage that. So we have to bring the fire down out of the tree canopies, get it on the ground, deal with it in the grass and the short brush, because that's what we can handle on the ground. Aircraft and shaded fuel breaks and such help with those situations. But again, that's to cool it so that we can get that fire down to the ground and put it out with firefighters.
Follow-up question is, if the tree is being maintained and is irrigated, is that as much of a concern?
My 2 cents on that from a statewide perspective is we recommend removing all dead and dying vegetation. There's nothing in our regulation that says you should remove healthy, well-maintained vegetation.
All right, I believe this next question is for Marcy. It's the San Diego Municipal Codes. Is Zone 1 0 to 35 or 0 to 30 feet?
Well, it depends. I mean, every property is different, but that's kind of like with when new construction, that's typically what the measurements are. But we will go out there, we'll look to see with the zone 1 is usually your backyard, the flat area, ornamental, you're irrigated. So we'll measure off of that. So it's kind of like a sliding scale that what zone 1 and zone 2 would be. And then the more zone 1 you have, the reduction you can get in zone 2. But typically for new construction, this is and based on this code, it would be that typically zone 1 is 35 and zone 2 would be 65. And then when we implement zone 0, that will change too.
Thank you. Next question, and I'm not sure this, I think is for all the panel members. Will these conservative pruning recommendations help if the roof is not combustible? So if the roof's made of metal, etc., is that a concern?
I'll jump in. So when looking at non-combustible or ignition resistant building materials, that is a huge step in the right direction for protecting your structure from ignition. So when we're looking at metal roofs, Class A fire rated roofing assemblies, things like tile and other non-combustible building materials for roofs, that's a huge step in the right direction. Now, let me caveat that with, we've seen these like Spanish tile style roofs, and they have that arch in the tile. If the end of the tile is not properly protected, then you have an arch and a nice little cubby right on top of your roof for embers to gather. And there are also typically other materials like bird nests.
We lost you for a second there, John.
Of the general material being used, but also how it's maintained and the assembly. So the assembly is how it's put together. So the assembly matters quite a lot.
Okay. Could you discuss fire safe options for property enclosure for privacy and security and fencing material options?
Does anyone have any examples at the local level? I have some.
I do not.
All right.
No, I don't.
So what I heard there was we're looking at some options for privacy screening, things of that nature. And, just to go with, let's just talk about that standard 6-foot tall wooden fence around the backyard of 99% of the houses in an urban development. You could simply replace any of that combustible material within 5 feet of the house with non-combustible material, and you're going to take a huge step forward in the maintenance and survivability of that structure. And so what can we use in place of that? Well, I know chain link fences are not very beautiful. However, when you use the aluminum or metal privacy slats that go in between the chain link pieces of linkage wire, they actually have many variations. Some of them that look like wood have like a wood grain stamped into the metal, and others that have literally murals. They're selling them as beautiful art pieces. So there are options for the aesthetics of fencing like that. What I've also seen are people using sheets of metal. So they'll place their posts where they want them for their privacy screen. This is typically seen around like a hot tub or something like that. And so it's not you're not trying to fence 2 acres of property with this, but something small around a hot tub. They'll place their posts in there, and then they have metal that it zigzags between the posts, and they alternate the zigzag from one piece to the next, and they're usually about a foot, maybe 18 inches in width, and the metal band runs the entire length of it. It looks absolutely stunning. Some people have, I've seen it done in aluminum. I've seen this done in other painted materials, but nonetheless, it needs to be ignition resistant or non-combustible.
Thank you. For the group, could you touch on the pros or cons of planted and of if plants and trees were more hydrated?
Mr. Just, do you have any comments on that?
On hydrated plants?
Yeah.
Well, I would imagine that's just, you know, landscaping, and that you actually got an irrigation system set up for it. You know, the plant itself, I think is probably fine, but you know, plants generate a lot of litter and, you know, debris that falls down out of the tree. So I think all of that material that eventually comes off of a tree anyway, would be more of the larger threat, I guess.
Yeah, and I would point us back to Greg Rubin's comment in the chat. It says our experience is that trees can act as ember catchers, coolers, and provide turbulation to perturb dry ember-laden winds. And I would say that, you know, when we're talking about well-maintained vegetation, it actually is a good thing. And that's why CAL FIRE does not advocate for a moonscape for 100 feet around a structure. And so, and I see your hand there, Mr. Rubin. The well-maintained and hydrated vegetation is a benefit more so than a hazard. Now, we'll see what the Board of Forestry's Zone 0 regulation turns out to look like. As I mentioned before, you can get a copy of what they've already released on their website. But everybody's kind of at the edge of their seat waiting to see the final result of that, Mr. Rubin.
Oh, I thank you. I just want to note that we conducted a 4-year research study for the Navy, Dr. John Keeley and myself, and what we found was that live fuel moisture content was highest for lightly hydrated native plantings, much more so than lightly hydrated non-native plantings, because they really are efficient with the water and hanging onto it. Followed by thin vegetation, 40 to 50%. It was surprisingly good. And then, of course, you know, we had the unmodified control. And, you know, we had weather stations, we had soil moisture meters, and we collected and tested for live fuel moisture content. And yeah, it was actually quite favorable. And it's borne out by experience, because I even have landscapes that were in the Harris fire, for instance, that the fire didn't even encroach into the mulch. I mean, it was just split, went around our customers, 2 different ones, and then headed right on up Lions Peak. So yeah, we've had some really incredible experience, consistent experience with lightly hydrated native vegetation, and also trees acting as ember catchers and, you know, helping to create turbulence instead of, you know, break up these flows. That's it.
All right, so I'm seeing a lot of comments here with concerns on, you know, balancing the benefits of having trees near structures, and also complying with these defensible space regulations. A lot of programs, we have an example here, the Cool Community Shade and Tree Program from SDG&E would require all trees provided would be within 40 feet of the structure for benefits. And so with trees needing to be 10 feet from the edge of a structure, and then some trees with large canopies, the center of the trunk would then need to be 30 feet if it was like a 40-foot canopy from the structure. How can we best balance these things? So the complying with regulations and also trying to get those benefits to the home.
Well, I guess I would say, one of the benefits that we haven't really mentioned about having trees is that it tends to shade out, volatile vegetation that would have otherwise have been growing in its place. So, I think trees are an important part of landscaping. I don't think we want to have a situation where we look like Las Vegas or something, some kind of pea gravel, no shade, no anything, because I kind of think of it in terms of, several years ago we used to require firefighters. We used dual layer PPE for firefighters. So they had their regular Nomex outfit on, and we had another Nomex outfit on top of it. And what we found was there were far more heat injuries and all of the other situations that created problems that we were trying to battle against, and the chances of a firefighter coming in close contact with flames where you would need that double layer Nomex was few and far in between. So the department went back to single layer Nomex because that way, firefighters could be cooler and they're not going to end up, going down with like a heat injury. And, I think it's similar to that with like the defensible space and the chances of you having a fire happen is, probably far less than all of the benefits you're going to gain from having trees in your yard and property on a day-to-day basis. The shading, the cooler houses, erosion issues, a lot of the other things like that. So, there's upsides to having trees on a day-to-day basis. It's not all downsides, I guess. So.
Awesome. Thank you. I think this will be our final question before we move on. And at this point, if you're looking to get your ISA CEUs, please put your full name in the chat along with your ISA credential number, and we'll make sure to get you on our CEU sign-in form. But to wrap this up, the last question I have, and this is coming again from the county's consolidated fire code, there is something in here that says streetscape plantings of non-fire resistant trees shall be planted so that the center of the tree trunk is 20 feet from the edge of the curb. And then fire resistant trees can be planted 10 feet from the edge of the curb. And so we know as urban foresters, a lot of our right-of-ways are, right along the edge of the curb, a couple feet from the edge of the curb. What does this imply and what does this mean for street plantings in our right-of-ways?
Well, I guess I'll try to take a stab at that one. I guess I can't speak specifically on like what the distances are and why that would be important. Other than, I guess it just comes down to firefighter safety is what I would assume that would be, first responder safety. Because you still need to be able to access streets and go up and down the streets, even if you're like in a fire situation. So I'm kind of going out on a limb, but I think that to me sounds like what the importance of that particular law is.
So I'm just hoping that doesn't mean, because I know this fire code actually covers the entire county, not just high fire areas. So it'd also cover a lot of the urban areas where, there's major efforts to increase canopy along roadways.
Yeah.
I'm just hoping this means that we are not going to be able to plant. It doesn't mean that we won't be able to plant trees along our roadways anymore, because that is, in general, where municipalities have land use and authority to plant trees. And then we also need them there for public benefits, like making sure people can walk or ride their bikes and there's shade available. And so I'm interested to learn a little bit more about that, but I'll touch base with you.
Yeah, I
All
guess.
right, thank you.
Oh, yeah. I was just going to add. Yeah, I guess the laws aren't real descriptive of why. It just says, oh, you're going to do this or you're going to do that. But the question is, well, why do we need to do that? And the fire code, it's not just addressing the home catching on fire. It also deals with how long dead end streets can be, what the turnaround distances are at the end, how often a fire hydrant should be put on the streets. And so it's also addressing trying to maintain our fire protection services while we have a fire situation. So your addresses on the street, on the sidewalk, and different things like that. So not everything's just house related. I think some of it's also first responder safety related.
That makes sense. Thank you. And thank you to all our speakers and our panel members for presenting today. Just to wrap everything up, we do have some upcoming events. I will put this link in the chat for our next tree drinks, which will be on June 13th from 5:30 to 7:30. We're looking to host this in central San Diego, so somewhere near downtown. And it will be $15. It will come with one free drink ticket. And let me see if I can get this link popped in here in the chat for you. We don't have time to do our normal networking and local updates today. That's something that we would normally do at our regular business meetings. But thank you, everybody. Please, if you're interested in getting involved with the regional council, let us know, send us an email, reach out to me directly. We are really looking for more membership. Have a wonderful day, everybody.
Great job, Megan.
Oh,
Thanks, Megan.
that was the wrong link.
Bye, everyone.